Okay, so welcome everybody to another Belcastro Agency webinar. I think this is our fifth. I was supposed to have Caitlin with me today, but we had some technical difficulties, so I'm going to do this one on my own. We wanted to do a series of webinars on genre, so today I'm going to be covering fantasy genre and some of the ins and outs related to that. So let me share my PowerPoint here. Okay, so genre fiction. So let's start with some definitions. What is a genre? A genre is a category of popular or commercial fiction. These are some of the main fiction genres. There are many, many more. I'm just showing you some of the more popular fiction genres. Romance, of course, suspense, thriller, mystery, fantasy, science fiction. And within those genres, there are also subgenres, which have their own kind of rules and guidelines. And the reason we wanted to do this series of webinars is because a lot of times we will get submissions that either are not what they claim to be, or they don't fit squarely into the genre that they are claiming to be. And it's super, super important, especially for agents and editors. If I'm an editor and I want to go pitch a book to my team in my publishing house, if I can give my team a market in which a book fits, then I can show them that there are already readers out there that are willing to buy it. And those readers have very specific expectations. And it's important that you meet those expectations. So a couple of notes before we get into fantasy. It depends who you ask, but my opinion, YA is not a genre, middle grade is not a genre. They are markets, they're age groups of readers. And I think a lot of times we'll call YA a genre because it has its own certain guidelines as well. But in my mind, it is not a genre. There are genres within YA and genres in middle grade that are similar or exactly the ones that I showed you. Stories that don't fall into any category of genre are typically considered just general fiction. Genre fiction is typically plot driven, and I don't want to mislead you at all. Plot is very, very important in genre fiction. However, the character is always key, but there is a plot that character is thrown into. And genre bending combines elements of various genres, so mixing multiple genres together. Okay, why is this important? So imagine as a consumer, you are really hungry and you're craving Chinese food. So you go to a Chinese restaurant and you step inside and there are pizza and hamburgers and spaghetti on the menu. As a consumer looking for Chinese food, you are not going to be happy because you had certain expectations of what you were going to be getting when you opened that door. It's the same with books. So when I open that cover and I step inside and I am a romance reader, there are certain things I'm expecting when I read that book. And so it's really important that you give that to your reader. And what are some of those expectations? So there's expectation when it comes to word count and character types and settings and themes and moods. For instance, if I read a cozy mystery, which are typically very short, say 70,000, 80,000 words, and I'm a cozy reader fan, and you give me a cozy mystery that is 140,000 words, I am not going to be happy with that because I'm expecting 70,000 words. So it's super important that you know what these expectations are and that you deliver them to your readers. So let's jump into fantasy. And as I said, there's a number of subgenres when it comes to fantasy. There's paranormal fantasies and urban fantasies and horror and epic fantasies or high fantasies. They're dark fantasy. And what distinguishes them? So a high or epic fantasy is typically the quest for a hero or a protagonist to solve a big world problem. The stakes are high, the action and adventure is high, and they're usually set in historical times, either based on a real historical time, or on actual events in history. Urban fantasies and contemporary fantasies. So I've broken those out because to me there is a distinction. Urban fantasies are set in current times, so 19th to 21st century. They're typically set in big cities, New York or Boston or something like that. Whereas contemporary fantasies are based in current time, but they can be set anywhere. They can be set in small towns, rural towns. They can be set in beach towns, that sort of thing. The distinction is the setting in those two. Dark fantasy, that is where the author combines elements of fantasy and horror. I think a good example of this one would be Frankenstein. So Frankenstein obviously has mythical creatures, so it's not a contemporary real elements. However, there are also elements of horror that are there to scare us or frighten us as readers. And then there are paranormal fantasies, and those are fantasies that typically contain vampires or werewolves or something along those lines. Sometimes they take place in an urban setting. I think a good example of that, and again, there is a little bit of overlap in some of these genres. So if you think about Twilight, it's set in an urban setting, and there's vampires and werewolves. It's not set in a big city, so but there are paranormal elements. So it falls anywhere from a contemporary fantasy, paranormal fantasy, even a romantic fantasy. As I said, word count is really important. So if I'm an epic fantasy reader, I'm expecting to read a long novel. So the word counts on those, and these are word counts typically for, because I know somebody is going to comment that, well, I read an epic fantasy that was 180,000 words, and you probably did. There are exceptions. However, for a debut, these are debut author word counts. And the reason these are important, again, is if I'm an editor and I am pitching this to my team, the more pages the book has, the more expensive it is to produce. So if you give me an epic fantasy as a debut author and I have no platform and I have no current readership, and it's going to cost a significant amount more money to publish a 180,000 word epic fantasy, it's going to hurt you as an author trying to break out. So for epic fantasy, you want to stay anywhere between 100 and 125,000 words. Absolute minimum is nothing under 80,000. And again, you could do plus or minus 10 on these, but I think this is a good sweet spot. Urban fantasies and horror fantasies and paranormals all fall between 75 and 95,000 words. These are word counts for adult. When you get to young adult, they vary a bit. So a young adult epic fantasy is going to be more like 80 to 100,000 words. A middle grade fantasy. So middle grade in general runs anywhere from 22,000 to 65,000 words. If you're writing an epic middle grade fantasy, you can get away with the upper end of that word count. You probably could even go anywhere around 80,000. Again, general guidelines, I think they're safe, they're sweet spots, and they will give you a better chance if you're pitching your first novel. Okay, so what are some of the key fantasy elements? Character, magic, the world or setting, the central conflict, and the power structure. So most fantasy novels that you read will have these elements. So let's start with character, and as I said before, no matter what genre you're writing, character is always the key and the most important. A reader wants to read about a character that they can relate to, that is compelling, that is navigating their way through some situation. And in fantasy, there are a number of different characters. I'm not saying that you have all of these characters, but these are typically what you will see. A hero or a heroine, and I'm going to distinguish that a bit from protagonists. They can be the same, sometimes they're not. The protagonist could be the main character that's telling the story, whereas the hero and the heroine is the character that is on the quest or adventure. A villain, a mentor, a sidekick, a henchman, a love interest, and a monster. One thing that I want to say here is avoid cliches and try to be original. And whether you're writing the heroes, the hero or the villain or the mentor, they all need to have their own motivation and their own depth. Don't make any of them too shallow. So just to give you some examples of some heroes and heroines in novels that I'm familiar with. Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, the main character is Kaz Brecker. Some might say he is an anti-hero, but he is the main character in the story and has the main character arc. Villain, I think one of the most famous examples is the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. So Dorothy, being the heroine, has to deal with the Wicked Witch of the West. Mentors. Luke Skywalker has Obi-Wan Kenobi and then later Yoda. Famous sidekicks, of course, Batman has Robin. Henchmen, that one's a little more difficult to me, I think. Actually, I had to look this one up, but Peter Pan and Peter Pan. You have Captain Hook, who uses Mr. Smee kind of as his henchman. So the henchman can be for the hero, the heroine, or the villain. A love interest, I think, is self-explanatory. And then some sort of mythical creatures or beings. So the heroine, and no matter if you are writing an epic fantasy or any genre, as I said, your main protagonist is very, very important. They need to be deeply compelling. They need to be relatable. We need to see our greatest desires in these characters. They need to be like us, but bigger, but they can't be perfect. They need to have some flaws. So obviously I have one of the most famous examples there, Harry Potter. You really feel for Harry. I mean, he lost his parents, he escaped death. He's a normal boy who had extraordinary things happen to him. He finds out he's a wizard. But yet he's not perfect. He's hot-headed, he's stubborn, but you can't help but love him. And I'm gonna go back to Kaz Brecker in Six of Crows, because as you'll see, that's one of my favorite fantasy novels. He is not a nice guy at all. He's very ruthless, he's very cold-hearted, but it's hard to dislike him because he has a very tragic past that we learn. He was swindled out of his life savings when he was very young, and his brother and himself contracted the plague, and his brother died from the plague, and they also thought Kaz was dead as well. So they kind of took all the bodies out onto the barge, dumped him into the water. Kaz was not dead, but he had to use his brother as kind of a life raft to make his way back into shore. So he has a very tragic past that kind of has made him who he is. So if you use an anti-hero, it's perfectly fine. Just give him some sort of human or compelling element so that the character, you know, he's not pure evil. Okay, so magic, and this one also is a little bit debatable. I have read some fantasies where there isn't strong magic systems. The one I can think of is The Thief or The Queen's Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. Books 1 and 2, they allude to the gods, but we don't see any of their magics. We don't see any of the gods. It strictly starts as a historical fantasy, but most novels and most readers will expect some magic in their stories. We need to know what the rules and limitations of this magic are. It cannot be the answer to every conflict. So you can't have some all-powerful being who have no limitations. We need to know how it affects your world. So as with any just general writing advice, anything you have in that novel needs to drive your plot, drive your theme. So we need to understand how that magic moves your plot forward and affects your story. It doesn't have to be a weapon. And the last point there, as I said, it should further your character and your plot. So I'll give you the example, another Leigh Bardugo, Shadow and Bone, which is her Grishaverse series. The Heartrenders, they are the most powerful Grisha in her world. They can stop the human heart. They can stop the airflow into the lungs. They're very, very, very powerful, and they're the most feared Grisha. However, they do have limitations even when they're on Param. So if their hands are tied, they cannot perform their magic. If they cannot see their victim or their intended subject, they cannot perform their magic. They can heighten their powers with a drug called Param, but Param is very dangerous to them, so they have to be careful. So again, you don't want to make this character who is all powerful, because we want to see our characters put in situations that they can't get out of. That's what really keeps the reader turning the page. So if you're in a scene in Grishaverse and there's a heartrender, you could guess that their hands are going to be tied in when they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because we want to see how they get out of that. Okay, so the world. This is super, super, super important in writing fantasy. And a lot of times the world or the setting becomes a character in itself. And we're not just talking the physical description of the world. We need to think about things like, what clothes do they wear? What food? What are the customs and religions? The names of the character? What's the weather like there? What's the government? All those elements need to be brought out in your world. And that is why these tend to be a little bit longer. Fantasies allow for more world building, especially in a higher epic fantasy. Don't info dump these on us. So don't tell us what the world is like. Show us what the world is like through the lens of the character. You know, what does he smell? What does he hear? What does he taste? We want to experience the world through your character itself, and that's the best way to convey the world to your reader. As with any good novel, this is not just specific to fantasy, but every novel needs a conflict. Characters need to be in conflict. We like to torture our characters. So it is very important that we have a good, strong central conflict. Could be external, could be internal, and could be both. We see Voldemort there with Harry Potter. Of course, everybody knows one of the most famous examples. It's the main conflict in Harry Potter. Harry wants the stone, and Voldemort's going to keep him from doing that. So if he wants that stone, he needs to defeat Voldemort. He also wants to avenge his parents' death. So he tends to be, so Voldemort is not only the main conflict, but he is the villain of the story. The Bone Witch by Rin Chapiko, one of my favorites. The main conflict in that story is with the Diaba. So T must defeat the Diaba that are ravaging the city or the town, ravaging her world. But there's also a really strong internal conflict that they bring out in this novel, and that's with society. So the Bone Witch are feared, they're ostracized, and so she must actually overcome the monster and her reputation within society. Similar with April Genevieve Tohaki's Boneless Mercy. So they are mercenaries. They are killers of, I don't want to say killers, they are mercies, they call them. So they actually go and euthanize, I guess is a good word, the dying in this society. So people are not left to die on their own. The mercies are called in and they will put them out of their misery. So they are also ostracized in their community. Of course, nobody wants to see them coming. So it's one of the main internal central conflicts that they need to overcome. But there's also a monster ravaging the next town, and Frey and her band of boneless mercies feel like if they can defeat that monster, they can get out of the life of being a boneless mercy and go on to bigger and better things. Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, another one of my all-time favorite fantasy writers, is more of an urban fantasy. That the main conflict is with angels and demons. So she's a demon, and Kiva is an angel. So there's not only the main conflict between the angels and the demons, but you have this personal conflict. They're attracted to each other. They are inherent enemies, and so they must overcome the war between angels and demons and between themselves. Another key element is there's always a power structure in these. So somebody is typically in charge. In Leigh Bardugo, Ninth House. So that would be more of a contemporary fantasy. The Dean of Lethe. So he is kind of in charge in that story. The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. You've got two kind of power struggles here. You've got the Duke and you got Barsavi. So the Duke is the political leader in the story, and Barsavi is kind of the crime lord. So he gives Barsavi a pass to rule his underworld as long as he does not infringe upon the kingdom. And then, of course, in Flames in the Mist, we have the Emperor of Wa in that story as the main character. And that's all I have. It's a bit shorter today because I'm doing it by myself, so we don't have other kind of people to jump in. But certainly, if you have any questions, reach out, leave comments on the video, and we would be happy to answer them. Please look forward to the next genre fiction webinar.